things. But all right, so I gave you this handout, and I want us to go to that. For those of you that are online, this is entitled Metaphysics and Epistemology 101, just a few of the basics. And you should have that, that should be available to you in some kind of PDF file. So go and look for that. We've talked about metaphysics quite a bit. So let's turn to page 2. And I want us to talk about a couple of new ideas. And I say they're new. I've alluded to this on several occasions as we're talking, but I haven't always tried to define it, because I thought, well, at some point I will. And so at this point in the class, that's what I'm going to do. I'm defining the term for you, metaphysical naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism. So, if you hear someone say they're a naturalist, what's your first intuition about them? What are they telling you? What information are they providing you about their view? They're probably what? They're probably an atheist. That's a certain understanding of naturalism, but what's kind of the popular culture understanding of naturalists? Yeah, they like the outdoors. They're organic. You know, they're concerned with nature, and just that's in the very kind of pop culture-y kind of way of thinking about it. But in philosophy, Soraya is exactly right. In philosophy, when we speak about naturalism, metaphysical naturalism, or something like that, this is the commitment that we are, this is what metaphysical naturalism is committed to. It is the belief that all objects, events, and values can be wholly explained in terms of factual and or causal claims about the world without reference to supernatural powers of authority. To say another way, naturalism is the view that the universe alone exists. Okay? So I'm introducing you to this idea not because I'm trying to propagate it or I'm trying to convince you it's the way to think about things. I think sometimes with some of my religious students, they assume that for some reason, I don't know, perhaps they've watched too many God's Not Dead videos. They think that all philosophers must be anti-religious. That's not true. Actually, there are more philosophers that are religious these days than there ever have been. And so there's no bias against that. The reason I'm introducing you to this idea is I'm trying to allow you to be able to see another metaphysical view, one that is based strictly in the natural world. You can think of it this way. You have the natural world, or if you like, we could say the natural universe. And what this position basically says is that's all there is. There's nothing else. Another conception says that there's a natural world / universe, and that there is on top of it a supernatural world. And I really don't even know how to even describe it, a dimension, it doesn't quite sound right to call it a universe. That's our physical definition of our own existence, but there's something supernatural that exists in another realm. And so it's a two-tiered system rather than a one-tiered system. And so if you like, naturalism's committed to this. And then really, just for clarity's sake, we could just call this supernaturalism. Supernaturalism doesn't deny the natural world or the universe. It just says that there is something beyond that, right? And so that's a distinction I think that's important to make. And the next thing I want to talk to you about is the conceptual distinctions concerning reality, certain conceptual distinctions concerning reality. I'm going to read this statement to you, and you tell me what's wrong with the statement. In 1628, William Harvey invented the circulation of blood. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He didn't invent it, did he? He discovered the circulation of blood, didn't he? Did the circulation of blood start in 1628? No, he was the first person that we know of to scientifically investigate this and seek to explain what was happening. Now, this very simple kind of mistake that maybe someone might make, it sounds like maybe a mistake even a young person might make in elementary school or maybe middle school. But this actually brings up a deeper philosophical problem when we look at the wide arena of human knowledge, from science to politics to ethics and aesthetics. How much is discovered and how much is constructed? How much of reality is discovered and how much is constructed? And so the question is ethics the attempt to find out what good is, just as Harvey discovered what the heart does? Is it a discovery process? Do we discover what is right and what is wrong? Is what is right and wrong woven into the fabric of the universe, kind of like other laws, like gravity? We didn't know about gravity. We didn't know what it was. But at some point, Isaac Newton pointed us in the right direction and said, look, this thing that happens that keeps us on the planet, this thing it's gravity. He began defining it. It wasn't that it just showed up suddenly. He just discovered something was already there. So the question is, are things like ethics and aesthetics, the study of beauty, are these things constructed by us, or are they already present and we just discover them through our looking at the world and trying to make sense of it? Some would say morality is just it's a human construct. It's no different than the rover that we built to put on Mars to analyze Mars. It's designed and constructed for purposes of efficient investigation. In the case of morality, it's designed for purposes of efficient human relationships. Okay? So, a philosophical realist is someone who believes the pursuit of knowledge is essentially about discovery. And so what this person suggests is that if you want to understand reality, it is an ongoing pursuit of discovery. That is what we do. Metaphysical realism is the view that what is real exists just as it is, independently of the subject that experiences. So, the realist perspective, philosophically, the metaphysical perspective is that things exist independent of you and I. All kinds of things. Both concrete things and abstract things. So, the idea of beauty being in the eye of the beholder, or beauty being objective and something that's present in the thing itself. Say that exists in reality, independent of you and I. That's what the realist would say. Or the idea that some things are good and some things are evil, that either exist in reality or not. The idea that this podium exists independent of you and me, that exists in reality as well. So you can see, so what this position basically says is that when we're pursuing knowledge about reality, it's essentially a voyage of discovery. Okay, turn the page. Anti-realism, and sometimes anti-realism is used in different senses, but it's a rejection of realism, that's for sure. You'll sometimes see it called irrealism. Maybe a more, a kinder, gentler term to describe this position would be non-realism. But what this position basically says is that there isn't an objective reality. There are only human constructs. One of the groups that's mentioned in the notes are idealists. Idealists say that all of reality is nothing more than human beings' concepts of a reality. Reality is dependent on humans for its existence. Okay, now I gave you a handout in which I listed out some introductory metaphysical categories. As well, if you're online, this is in your notes. It's entitled Introductory Metaphysics Categories. So let's just look at that and work our way through this so that we can kind of get a feeling for these two different, disparate ways of seeing the world, okay? The first, realism is easier to understand in a way. It's also easier to disagree with, according to many of my friends who are not realists. Let's see what it actually says here. Okay, one, ontological realism. Ontological realism is the view that physical objects exist independently of our own minds. This is fairly straightforward. So what this view says is that this podium, it exists without me. It says that Nicholas, it exists without me. It says that tree out there, it exists without me. It says that this computer, it doesn't need me. It doesn't need anybody. It has independent existence. That's ontological realism, okay? It doesn't need another mind in order for it to continue to exist. It just does. Two, epistemological realism is the view that propositions are true or false, independent of whether we know or believe them to be true. So there's certain statements that we can make about the world that are true or false, whether we know or believe them to be true. So for example, the proposition God exists. That is either true or false. That's a binary choice. There's no other choices. Either there is a divinity or there isn't a divinity. And so the epistemological realism just simply says that something exists independent of whether we know it or not. This isn't that hard of an idea to wrap your minds around. Let's take mathematics. How many in here know trig in calculus? Okay, we've got a couple of people. We've got a few people. Nice. Got several people in here that are fairly familiar with these things. Suppose I said to you, hey, you know, I don't know that stuff, so I don't really believe that it has existence. I haven't studied it, so I don't grant it existence. It doesn't exist to me. Yeah?
Would you be wrong? Because you don't know it.
I would be wrong because it does exist, and there's people to say, look, I can show you. I can do it, right? That's the point. Epistemological realism says, notice what it says. It says, it's the view that propositions are true or false, independent of whether we know or believe them to be true. So there is a reality about it. Now you may say, well, what if they're lying? It still doesn't change the fact calculus and trigonometry exist. That's either true or false, right? It's verifiable. And so what the realist says is that whether you know it is not really relevant. As the subject, that doesn't demonstrate anything. Let's use DNA. We talked about blood. DNA, does anybody know when was DNA actually discovered? 20th century. Scientists accidentally discovered it, honestly. That's the way a lot of science happens. It's not usually from purposeful investigation that they discover some ideas. It was an accidental discovery in a way. But DNA, did DNA come into existence when they discovered it? No. It's been around since the very beginning. And what epistemological realism says is that the proposition DNA exists is true or false, independently of whether we know it or not. That's what the claim is. Okay? 3. Moral realism is the view that acts are morally right or wrong, independent of whether we judge them to be right or wrong or not. Moral realism is the view that acts are morally right or wrong, independent of whether we judge them to be right or wrong or not. And so all this is saying is, as you can see, I mean, we're just going down the realist track here. They're saying that there's some propositions, there's some things that are right, and there's some things that are wrong. It's going to attack and disbelieve and challenge the notion of moral relativity. It's going to say morality is not relative. If morality is relative, then there was nothing evil about the extermination of 6 million Jews by Adolf Hitler in the Third Reich. There was nothing evil about it. If there are things that you could point to and say there are moral absolutes, then you are in some ways acknowledging that there is a moral reality. If you think that murder is wrong, by murder I mean killing an innocent person for pleasure, for example. This would be one manifestation of it. If you think that would be wrong, then you're identifying an absolute moral standard. If you think that torturing infants for pure pleasure is wrong, then you are saying that there's a moral standard that you would judge someone on, and you would say, that's evil, that's wrong, you ought not to do it. That's what the moral realist is saying. He's not saying everything that everybody says is immoral. That's not what they're saying. What they are saying is that there are some things that are right and there are some things that are wrong. Sometimes people bring up slavery to me. They'll say, well, slavery is evidence that really morality changes. No. If slavery was wrong yesterday, it was wrong 100 years ago, it was wrong 1,000 years ago, it was wrong 1,000,000 years ago. Well, what about all these societies that had slavery? What about them? They were just wrong. They did something that was evil. They did something they ought not to do. If it's wrong, it's wrong. sometimes we just don't know any better. For hundreds and thousands of years, we thought the earth was flat. There was a common belief. The earth is flat. It's not round. It's not, the sun doesn't, the earth doesn't revolve around the sun. The earth is the center of the universe. That was the understanding. Most people believe that. Guess what? They were just wrong. It's not relatively true. Right? They had a false idea. They believed something that wasn't true. Well, why would you say, well, in the realm of morality, then people can't be wrong? Well, that seems a little bit mistaken. Okay? All right. Now, aesthetic realism. Aesthetic realism is the view that beauty is a real property of works of art and other physical objects and persons there to be discovered by the discerning viewer. So what this view says is that beauty exists independent of the perceiver. It exists in things themselves. And so what we have to do is we have to figure out what are the common properties, what are the qualities that are present in all beautiful things. If we look at, if we analyze any substance, we call things substances. Any substance we analyze, we can look at what's essential to the thing, and we can look at what is accidental to the thing. Let me show you this. All right. So, I mean, we could do a substance analysis of anything. Substances are basically any material object we want to look at. And what we can do is we can identify things that are essential to the thing. They are what make it what it is. And we look at things that are accidental to the thing. Okay? Essential properties, we call them. These are just things that are present in the object. So essential property. So let me give you an example. So I have this phone. What is, there might be more than one essential property, but what do you think is an essential property of this particular device? Notice I did call it a phone, but is that really what it is? I mean, that's actually a misnomer, isn't it? It's not accurate to call it a phone, really. It's not completely accurate. And I think part of the reason is why is because when we originally started out, it was a phone. That was all it was. I mean, some of you haven't been around long enough to know that, but when we really did start out with just a phone. And then, wow, what an advance. Then we could text. That was amazing. And then, you know, it morphed into this thing. But what's essential to this thing? In order for it to be what it is, what's essential to it? Shape? I don't know. I have a computer that can do a lot of the same things. It doesn't seem like that would be it. Charging. For its continued existence, it might need that. Of course, we could keep it plugged up all the time. We might need electricity for it to continue. I'm thinking more along the lines of these things seem to be, the things you're bringing up seem to be accidental. They're accidental to it. In other words, the size of it, the shape of it, the power sources of it. But what is absolutely essential for this to be what it is and for it to be able is connectivity. Connectivity. So if it is unable to connect, then it's something different than what its purpose is. And so that's what we do. We look at things and we try to figure out what's essential to the thing and then what's accidental to it. So we were talking about human beings earlier, so let me just go back to that for just a minute. So I can talk to you about human beings. We can talk about accidental properties of human beings, and we talk about what's essential. This is where it gets interesting. Accidental properties are easy to identify. So what are some accidental properties? Are properties present in a thing that don't make it what it is, but that incidentally are a part of that being. So what do you think are some accidental properties we could point to? Okay, what you're wearing, that's accidental. But the human themselves, what would be, height, weight, eye color, gender,
Knowledge.
intelligence, ethnicity. You see all these things? They don't, and by the way, before you say ethnicity or race or something like that, if you say, well, how is that, if that, in the past, people have used these things as a way of saying, well, look, we're superior, we're better, right? The Nazis, for example, part of the justification that they used for their extermination of 6 million Jews was, they said, we're of the Aryans, the enlightened ones. We are an evolved species. Lesser species, survival of the fittest is the case. Lesser species, we're going to help evolution along and get rid of lesser species. And so they said the Jewish people, they are a lesser species. They use that as a way of justifying their extermination of them. And what they basically said was essential to being human, superhuman, the Aryans, the Übermensch, is Germanness. See, notice how nationality comes into it. Other species can be eliminated. So what they did was they came up with an essential property, or maybe what a superior human being is a white man, as opposed to another race or something like that. That is how this kind of stuff can be abused. But when we look at it, it's not at all obvious. And so you can see how humans have made these errors all across time. Again, if it was wrong 100 years ago to exterminate 6 million Jews on the basis of their ethnicity, it was wrong yesterday, and it was also wrong 1 million years ago. It doesn't, that doesn't change things. Morality doesn't change, and ultimately things that have existence according to the realist don't change. So interestingly, when you talk about the idea of beauty, beauty has essential properties as well and accidental properties. And I don't have time to go into that today. Maybe we will in the future, but I just wanted you to kind of have a sense of that. Okay, now let's move along here. You can see underneath number 4, it says keys. The keys to understanding this family is discovery and that reality is mind independent. It's discovery and that reality is mind independent. Now, members of the family of non-realism, anti-realism, irrealism. Number 1, ontological idealism. This is a form of non-realism. Ontological idealism is the view that objects are of their essence non-material and would not exist if there were no mind or spirit. We'll talk about this later in the class. George Berkeley, he suggested this. He says that there really is, the only reality that exists are the realities that exist in mind. There are only minds and ideas. There is no independent reality. Very controversial position, but one that he attempts to defend. Number 2, epistemological relativism is the view that what is true or false and underline this, always depends upon one's historical, social, and or individual perspective. Epistemological relativism is the view that what is true or false always depends on one's historical, social, and or individual perspective. What this view says is that all knowledge is culturally conditioned. All knowledge is culturally conditioned. Now, if it is true, then I'm not sure how that we can ever get to agreement on much of anything, even 2 + 2 = 4. If all knowledge is culturally conditioned, it doesn't seem that way. I mean, when you go to India and they write code for computers, it seems that computers work exactly the same way in India, and they use the same code as they do in the United States and America. It doesn't seem that all knowledge really is culturally conditioned. You may say some is, but this view claims that all is. And once you admit that relativism isn't true, then the next question is, well, what is true? What do we really know? What is the nature of reality? I may not be able to know everything, but I should be able to know some things. All right, number 3. Ethical subjectivism is the view that judgments of right and wrong are nothing more than subjective approval or disapproval. So notice what this is getting at. It's saying far from what the moral realist says, ethics is nothing more than me saying hooray for some action I think is a good one, or boo towards some action I think is a bad one. If I say that Adolf Hitler shouldn't have killed those 6 million Jews, all I'm saying is, boo Hitler. I don't like Hitler. I'm just emoting. I'm just giving my feelings about it. That's all morality is. It's a sentiment. It's subjective approval or disapproval. And in fact, the only reason that I speak ill of Hitler is because we as a collective group, the majority of us have said Hitler was a bad person. You see, we all say boo, and thus he's a bad person. But for the subjectivists, they're going to say there's no moral reality. So such a claim is mistaken by the realist. Aesthetic irrealism is the view that judgments of beauty and works of art, objects, persons, etc., are nothing more than expressions of personal taste. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, according to the irrealist. When someone says something's beautiful, they're just saying it's beautiful to me. It's not beautiful because it's beautiful in its own way. It doesn't have beauty in itself. And this, of course, is making a metaphysical claim. So, McDowell's notes about this. Please notice the family resemblances and relatedness. You can see that if you're committed to realism or non-realism, there's a lot of relationships between these various approaches to thinking about the world. Also note that some philosophers will mix and match these families, creating a blended family. Over the years, I've known people that would tell me, well, I'm an ontological realist, but I'm not a moral realist. I'm an ethical subjectivist, and I'm an aesthetic irrealist. So it's not impossible for someone to create their own metaphysic where they mix and match these things. But I will say there is a difficulty with consistency. They seem to be inconsistent with such an approach. Lastly, realism is the most ancient and the common sense view. Of course, this doesn't prove anything. The common sense / ancient view has been wrong about quite a lot of things. And I would say that's true. I will say that when we start looking at the beginnings of philosophy, what you'll see is that most of the philosophers we look at, almost all, are committed to some form of realism in one shape or another. It's only as you move through history, and particularly you move in the modern and postmodern age, you begin to see people reevaluate that, begin to think differently. And we'll get to a little bit of that.